Except for the southern Appalachians and parts of Florida, the Southeast generally has very little federal, state, and local government land that can be used for creating wildlands. Of the 7 states, Florida, with 29%, is leading the way in creating wildland reserves and the concept of sustainable development. Only Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina have completed their federal gap analyses. While Mississippi's data provides some indication of protected status, the remaining states are not available to the public. Even if wilderness and roadless areas are included, the southeastern region only has a small to moderate amount of public land to protect what wildlands ecologists claim are essential ecosystems in the region. In 1999 to 2000, the Environmental Protection Agency and the University of Florida conducted a study of gap and other data called the Southeastern Ecological Framework Project. The project attempted to prioritize ecological areas in the southeast that wildlands ecologists believe need protection. As would be expected when ecosystems are given such a high importance, nearly 75% of the region was identified as having high protection priority. As always, nearly all of the identified need occurred in rural areas. Wildlands ecologists are evaluating all state and federal land for inclusion as wildland reserves and corridors. However, even if all the existing government lands are converted from multiple-use to single-use protection, these ecologists believe that most ecosystems will be vastly underprotected. Although other ecologists would disagree, wildlands ecologists believe that huge areas of present-day private land, mostly in rural areas, will have to be purchased or heavily regulated to provide the protection they claim is needed to save biodiversity in the region. Of all the states in America, Florida is one of the states most aggressively implementing the Wildlands Project. In the early 1990s, the Wildlands Project worked with the Florida Game and Freshwater Fish Commission, the Nature Conservancy, the Florida Natural Areas Inventory Program, and regional conservation biologists to place 70 to 80% of the state of Florida into wilderness reserves, corridors, and buffer zones in the next 100 years. As seen in their own map, Florida started with only 29% of the state in government land. The other 71% was private land. To accomplish their long-term goal, the Florida State Legislature created the Massive Preservation 2000 program in 1990. $3.5 billion was provided to purchase private land, some of it through condemnation. In 2000, the name was changed to Florida Forever, and another $3 billion was provided for private land acquisition. By 2005, environmental NGOs in the state of Florida were hoping to have as much as one-third of Florida in wilderness reserves, corridors, and buffers, as depicted in their own map. Note that Florida's initial goal was to, quote, prevent development of critical areas even if they cannot be protected immediately, unquote. This is called greenlining, which prevents other people from buying the land and lowers the property value to the lowest level by drawing a line around the targeted lands for later acquisition by the state. By 2095, environmental NGOs and the Florida government is hoping to have as much as 80% of Florida in wilderness reserves, corridors, and buffer zones. Note that roughly 70 to 80% of the land is what the Wildlands Project and the state believes is needed to ensure biological health of the state. By default, human beings are less important in this process than plants and animals.
In 2004, this long-term goal was set into policy with the issuing of the report entitled Update of the Florida Ecological Greenways Network by the Office of Greenways and Trails within the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. The report called for the additional acquisition of 2.4 million acres, as shown in the mustard and bright green, plus the grape-colored areas in the map. This was to be acquired on top of over 2.2 million acres already purchased since the early 1990s. Those purchases occurred in a systematic fashion under the Preservation 2000 and Florida Forever programs.
As with all states, the state of Florida started in the 1990s with a mix of federal and state and local ownership accounting for 29% of the land area of the state. The federal gap analysis revealed that only a small amount of the government land in Florida was fully or partially protected. However, even before the gap analysis was undertaken, Florida had already launched a major land acquisition program to buy private land that wildlands ecologists believe were critical to protecting the ecosystems of Florida. By 1999, 1.3 million acres were purchased by the state of Florida under the Preservation 2000 program, as seen in the brownish-orange areas in this map prepared by the South Florida Water Management District. New lands were targeted for acquisition after 2000 under the Florida Forever program. These are identified in red on the map. This is greenlining and typically locks land value at rock-bottom prices, thereby denying the landowner any chance for receiving highest and best value for his land. The Save Our Rivers program of Florida Forever has greenlined dozens of parcels of private property. These are but a few examples to illustrate the magnitude of the program. The blue and dark green blocks are potential acquisition areas or other SOR projects that are underway. Although the state attempts to be fair with the landowners, once the private land is greenlined, the landowner is forced to sell to the state, often at depressed prices.
By 2007, another 1 million acres were purchased throughout the state. Together, the Preservation 2000 and Florida Forever programs have acquired 2.3 million acres at a cost of $5.1 billion. An additional 379,000 acres were purchased using conservation easements at a cost of $280 million. Simple math shows that the purchased lands were acquired at $2,200 an acre, while the easements were acquired at just under $755 an acre, or only one-third the price of an outright purchase. Although other factors may be playing a role in this difference, the ratio is not unusual. Together with the Save Our Everglades program, the state of Florida has purchased nearly 2.8 million acres for a total of $6.1 billion.
By 2005, greenlining and the use of conservation easements had worked very well to lower property values and keep the Florida Forever program under budget, as evidenced by the accomplishments for southern Florida. The government benefited at the expense of landowners who were targeted by the state. Notice how these acquisition areas always fall on rural areas where rural citizens have little voice in what happens to them. Urban voters can outvote hapless rural voters nearly 5-to-1 on rural land use restrictions. Urbanites desire open land where they can escape the congestion and the pollution of their own making and supposedly protect biodiversity at the same time. The full weight of the program falls on these powerless rural citizens. Even if all government lands are converted from multiple use to single use preservation, many wildlands biologists and environmentalists believe that ecosystems in the state are underprotected. Most citizens of Florida do not fully understand what the state intends to do, yet it is very real and considerable progress has already been made. This is especially true in the southern Appalachian Mountains, where environmental non-governmental organizations are pushing hard for more wildlands. The effort is led by the Southern Appalachian Forest Coalition, a group of 22 environmental NGOs along the Appalachians. According to the coalition's own literature, they lobby to convert existing multiple-use lands to form the core of a wildlands reserve system as depicted in the blue areas of their maps. They also propose to acquire private land or conservation easements to fill out gaps that are in light green within the Forest Service boundaries. Fortunately, the impacted states have not passed legislation like Florida's that would have accelerated the process. Nonetheless, the program is still advancing piece by piece. As just reviewed, dozens of non-governmental organizations have stated that all private land within current U.S. Forest Service boundaries should be targeted for purchase as soon as possible. The Wildlands Project itself has proposed the purchase of additional private land to form the interconnecting corridors as depicted in this map. This is just the start. The EPA's Southeastern Ecological Framework Project identified huge areas of private land in green as essential ecological hubs requiring protection in the near future. As always, nearly all of the identified need occurs in rural areas. Unless stopped, aggressive land acquisition programs like Florida Forever may soon be implemented across all the states in the Southeast, as well as the entire United States.